Deconstructing. Your truth, my truth, their truths. Narratives. Oppressive. Silencing. A few buzzwords we hear repeated over and over again like some kind of hypnotic mantra. Sometimes we catch ourselves incorporating them in our everyday speech, and sometimes we even feel pressure to conform to this type of language. But let's pause for a moment. Have you ever stopped to think about what these words actually mean? Where do they come from? When did they first appear? Hello everyone, welcome to my legal philosophy channel. Now in this video, we will be examining Jacques Derrida's theory of deconstruction and consider its pervasiveness in Western culture today. Deconstruction is the philosophical method developed by Jacques Derrida in order to expose power hierarchies embedded in a particular linguistic text. Derrida's focus was language. However, he envisaged their application in education, ethics, and law. And in modern times, we see it being extended to social and political spheres. This video is entitled Deconstructing Derrida because this is precisely what I propose to do. I intend to turn this philosophy on its head with a view to exposing the hidden agendas of authors who enlist this method in order to advance their truths, which, let's be real, in most cases simply amounts to propagating misinformation and advancing personal agendas. So, first of all, what is deconstruction? Deconstruction literally means to break something down to its component parts to better understand its meaning. However, in philosophy, deconstruction refers to a process by which language is dismantled, specifically in order to expose the message that lies beneath the surface. The assumption here is that the message found after deconstruction is different from the one we already know about the text. As such, a deconstructionist examines what is said, but also what is not said. I recall first encountering deconstruction in high school English class. I did some quick background research of contemporary lesson plans in secondary education across the US and also in Australia to find that when it is still taught in schools, educators stated that they intentionally do not teach the students the theory in order to avoid confusing them, or so they say. And we'll return to this point later. But let's consider firstly what is taught in schools, so the method of deconstruction. So deconstruction as a literary method is premised on the idea that logical structures exist in binaries or in pairs. A binary refers to a situation where two concepts are in contention with one another, so at odds with one another. For example, speech, text, mind, body, masculine, feminine, black, white, fat, thin. Now, deconstructionists argue that in analyzing these binaries, we find that these concepts exist in some kind of a symbiotic relationship where there is a fundamental interdependence between them. So what we originally thought were inherently distinct concepts are actually interdependent. In fact, we can go even further to say, if we're deconstructionists, that they are two sides of the same coin. Derrida, the author of this method, even uses the term interlaced to describe the relationship between these concepts. So what deconstructionists conclude is that the meaning as we know it of any specific word can only be defined by reference to its binary. For example, one cannot define life unless we contrast it with death. Thus, the process of deconstruction always involves looking at a word not for what it is, but to determine what it is not. At this point, it is pertinent to quickly raise a key term associated with the deconstructive method, and that is différance, which is a French term used by the author of this methodology to describe a central aspect of his theory. Différance comes from the French verb différer, which means to differ as well as to defer. Firstly, if A differs from B, these two things are not the same. Secondly, if A differs to B, one exists in a codependence with the other. Derrida contended that words both differ from each other and defer to one another for meaning. So a famous example of this binary relationship between words is found in Jacques Derrida's 1967 book titled Dissemination. The example that Derrida evokes in this work uses the idea of the preface of the book to illustrate this binary relationship. When we think of a book, we think of the body of the text, and we think of the preface as a supplement to that text. However, in practice, the author, Derrida, noticed that when one writes the preface after they have completed the writing of the whole, and this revealed to Derrida that the preface was not a supplement, but part and parcel of the thing itself. So it's not a preface, literally speaking, something that appears before the face, but actually is part of the body and the orienting force. So if meaning arises from the constant interplay of two words, deconstruction is a language game. A game always has an end goal, or that's what we have thought till now. And we'll consider what the end game is of this particular philosophy in the next part of the video. But first of all, let's delve a little deeper into the methodology itself. So in his book entitled Of Grammatology, Derrida contends that there is no bedrock to meaning when you're dealing with language. Words are simply signifiers. The defining of terms as signifiers is significant itself because it suggests that the words do not hold value in and of themselves and are thus not representational of meaning, rather than words referring to the nature of the thing itself. It is actually referring to its characterization by the Western philosophical tradition. Let's give an example for clarity's sake. To Derrida, the word flower might evoke different types of things to different people. Each person has a different projection when the word is uttered. Some think of a rose, others think of a sunflower. Some might think of a bouquet of flowers they once received. However, as realists at this juncture, we might be tempted to conclude that just because we all have different subjective experiences regarding the word flower, this does not negate from the fact that a pure form of the thing exists out there in the abstract. However, Derrida argues that the word flower possesses no real meaning in itself. We have simply been taught to think it does. In fact, for each individual, the word is so bound up with a person's subjective experiences with respect to that word that we cannot separate the feelings from the thing from the signifier. And these subjective associations depend on the type of discourse or class that we as individuals belong to and have belonged to throughout our lives. Have you ever heard the expression, my lived experience? Now, this is where it seems to have originated. When Derrida alludes to discourses, he is referring to a specific class to which an individual finds themselves, like it's affiliated with, as in identifiers, for example. So I might belong to the discourse of female, an academic, an Asian woman, etc. These can be used as my identifiers and continue to permeate my experiences and the meaning of the words I use and hear, according to Derrida. This would in turn combine to form what deconstructionists call my truth. Hence, instead of positing that there is the meaning to a particular word, Derrida begins by calling these words signifiers, establishing them as conduits for a range of different experiences, depending on the person or agent who is using them. Moreover, the meaning of signifiers is only found in relation to other words in a binary relationship. What follows is that meaning changes over time as these words renegotiate dominance within a specific linguistic or textual context. This means that philosophy is essentially an endless play of words, where words as signifiers defer to each other for meaning ad infinitum, whereby the only realities produced are those created in relationship to other words. So returning to the term different, words not only differ in relation to the other, but also defer to others within a broader economy of meaning that has been established culturally, traditionally, and historically. This theory would suggest that the word dog, for example, has no meaning in and of itself, but only derives meaning from the fact that it is not a cat or a fish or a tree. The meaning of a word thus derives as much meaning from what it does not signify than also what it does. Moreover, what we deem to be a dog is a product of an institutionalized characterization of the thing by persons, cultures, and conventions of the past. So the implications of this method is twofold. Firstly, there are many signifiers battling for dominance, but there is no such thing as a transcendental signifier, and Derrida makes this clear. Deconstruction expressly denies the possibility of something that holds independent value. Very postmodernist, you might think. Secondly, truth as we know it is merely a construct, something created by past societies, cultures, and political systems. So regarding specifically the absence of a transcendental value in this method, it distinguishes it from all other philosophical traditions. The very nature of philosophy involves the pursuit of some reality-based knowledge. This knowledge presupposes that there is an ultimate truth, which is also called an a priori norm, the thing of ultimate value, which is itself underived. Now, Plato called this the form of the good in his theory of the forms. Aquinas calls it first principles. Hans Kelsen, a German scholar in the positivist tradition, called it the Grundnorm or basic norm. Kant called it the categorical imperative. In Taoist philosophy, they call it the Tao, the ultimate principle undergirding all realities. Now, these are just a few examples from a broad and long tradition of philosophy. By contrast, deconstructionists decry the very notion of truth, and unlike other philosophical traditions which posit some pursuit of truth, deconstructive theory appeals to or reverts to the endless deferral to signifiers. So words as signifiers are mere social constructs which with virtually no meaning in and of themselves once they are divorced from their historical and social milieus. This separation is both what happens and what is desirable. And on that note, let's have a look at deconstruction as a philosophy. So in 1948, George Orwell, the renowned dystopian novelist, first published his Canon of Literature 1984. In Part 2, Chapter 9, Orwell refers to the Ministry of Truth as a misnomer for the organ of government tasked with peddling propaganda in its fictional totalitarian state. Now, this ministry spreads a new language among the populace called Newspeak, in which truth is understood to mean statements like 2 + 2 = 5, whenever the political agenda calls for it. Orwell aptly names this manufacturing of truth through language doublethink, and the book describes the doctoring of historical records to the government-approved version of events. The following is a useful excerpt from this prescient book for the purposes of our discussion today. The Ministry of Peace concerns itself with war, the Ministry of Truth with lies, the Ministry of Love with torture, and the Ministry of Plenty with starvation. These contradictions are not accidental, nor do they result from ordinary hypocrisy. They are deliberate exercises in doublethink. Now, with that 1948 warning resonating in our minds, let's turn to consider the philosophical underpinnings of the deconstructive method. And we can call this its broader normative philosophy. And by normative, I refer to norms, if any, that this method appeals to or espouses for its validity. The founder of deconstruction, as I said, was Jacques Derrida, who was a French philosopher born in 1930, best known for his articulation of postmodernism and its philosophical method, deconstruction. His writings first appear in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and immediately garner academic interest, gaining widespread influence and prominence throughout the United States upon translation from French to English in the 1980s. We also see in the 1990s and 2000s, it begins to infiltrate education both at the secondary and tertiary levels. The effects of this are now being acutely felt. The deconstructive methodology and its associated philosophy have permeated all of Western societies within the American cultural sphere of influence. Originally writing on the philosophy of language, Derrida's later work addressed ethical and political themes. His seminal works of Grammatology, 1967, Writing and Difference, 1967, Dissemination, 1972, Positions, 1972, Margins of Philosophy, 1976, and I'll discuss briefly or mention his essay called The Force of Law, The Mystical Foundations of Authority, which was penned in 1992, and that will be touched upon in this video. At the outset, it is interesting to note that the term deconstruction by its very nature strongly suggests the act of defying institutionalization through language. That is, deconstruction sets any pre-existing conventional normal systems as subject for or the object of deconstructing, dismantling, decoding, and demolition. So what is the desired end game of this theory? So this is a language game, and in games, the desired outcome is usually for someone to win. Who wins in deconstruction? Let's find out. So the ontology of deconstruction, the raison d'être, or its reason for being, is first outlined in Derrida's work of Grammatology, where the author explores the intersection between language and the construction of meaning through institutionalization. When we unpack this ontology further, we see three key features emerge. First, the inherent desire to have a focal point to structure understanding, logocentrism, which is what is being questioned. And we see, second, the reduction of meaning to set definitions that are committed to writing. So he says that there is nothing outside of text. So everything is manufactured. And finally, to explain how the reduction of meaning to writing captures opposition within that concept itself, difference. So the binary situation. These three conceptual blocks make it possible for deconstruction to be an ongoing process of questioning the accepted basis of meanings. So the starting point for Derrida's deconstructive method is the assertion that modern Western philosophy is characterized by and constructed around an inherent desire to place meaning at the center of being. Put simply, this means that philosophy is driven by an inherent desire for certainty, which in turn is grounded in the existence of an absolute truth. As such, philosophy involves the pursuit of truth in order to make sense of our place in this world. Derrida identifies this desire as logocentrism. So this is the act of placing concepts like justice at the center of all our efforts to theorize meaning. And according to Derrida, this term becomes the focal point around which meaning is constructed, as well as the point of reference for determining all subsequent knowledge. Derrida's philosophy thus begins by questioning this idea, logocentrism, and its assumption that a set of stable meanings exists and are waiting to be found. So essentially what Derrida is trying to question here is in line with postmodern theory, and it's the very notion of truth itself. The manner in which he proposes to do this is by dismantling the concept of logos, so truth or reason, through language. And this is because Derrida believed that language is the means by which logos is embodied in our world. Derrida contends that the starting point for interrogating logos is by, in his words, problematizing language or the text. As the text is the embodiment of logos, one must first separate the concept from its written form. He calls this problematizing the relationship between the nature of logos, say justice, and the institution or its linguistic embodiment, for example, law. The only truth, if we can ever call it that, which is present in deconstruction, is the relentless interplay between the signifiers and their accepted meanings. That is, deconstruction is and ought to be the renegotiation between the nature of the thing and its linguistic embodiment. As counterintuitive as it may seem, at its very core, the concern of deconstruction is countering the idea of a transcendental value. It both refutes and desires to refute the notion that there is any possibility of a natural reference point, so a standalone truth. As we noted, according to Derrida, there is nothing outside of text, and the origin of a thing can only exist within a classification and therefore within a system of difference. And in this context of difference, meaning can neither be fixed or static, but is evolving constantly. It arises from an endless process of negotiation between competing norms, and that is why a seemingly simple question regarding a concept such as what is a woman becomes impossible to answer. Further, in the process of deconstruction, meaning is defined equally by the author's intention for the text as well as the interpretation of the same text by the reader. So not only is meaning equally what is included in the text and what is not, but meaning is determined both by the author and by the reader. So the meaning of a text is both what is foregrounded and what is backgrounded or silenced. And the inclusion of one thing at any given time points to what has been excluded, or the presence of what has been excluded. For example, two things like writing and speech exist in a relationship hierarchy, constantly negotiating and renegotiating dominance in respect of the other. The dominant concept is the one that manages to attain textual or linguistic legitimacy, and this is accomplished by wresting the competing interpretation which remains trapped in the background of the text and simply contained as part and parcel of the meaning of the dominant concept, so freeing it from its backgrounded state. Whilst deconstruction originally arose in the context of language, it has been applied to the study of law. Derrida considered deconstruction to be a problematizing of the foundation of law, morality, and politics. In fact, it was foreseeable and, moreover, desirable to him that deconstruction be used to problematize the relationship between law and justice. It can therefore be the means by which the relationship between law and justice may be further interrogated. In his work Positions, Derrida reveals the way in which deconstruction overturns the hierarchy. It is to expose the subordinating structures of opposition, he calls it. This is to highlight the dominance of one particular way of thinking over others, which first necessitates the belying of the idea of fixed meaning, overturning it, interrogating it, and exposing the existence of the binary and releasing it from its marginalized and backgrounded state and into the light. So giving voice to the silence. Does that sound familiar to you? So what is the end game? The ultimate concern for deconstruction is not the discovery of truth or of reaching a correct conclusion. The ultimate pursuit of this methodology is with the process of interrogation itself. In other words, the process is inherently characterized by the sense of uncertainty and indeterminacy. And for this reason, Derrida explains deconstruction is not a method with an end. One does not apply deconstruction to test a hypothesis or support a conclusion. Rather, the act itself is an endless process of interrogation to dismantle the structure of meaning itself. As I said in previous videos, the aim of this methodology is the methodology. It does not aim to build up, but to break down. It is neither an analysis or a critique, because it does not happen with a particular goal in mind. It is not in search of an a priori normative position, first principles, or underivable truths. Deconstruction is not linked to any type of subsequent reconstruction. Its aim is to break down for the sake of breaking down. So though Derrida argues that deconstruction is this way, he says it's not nihilistic. However, if you do put it in practice, it inevitably has this effect. Deconstruction does not set out to provide answers. It only asks questions of everything. It does not seek to prove an objective truth or support a particular claim. The reason for deconstruction is itself indeterminate. So in his article, The Force of Law, in 1992, Derrida concedes that deconstruction is impossible. The happening of deconstruction is not going to lead to a determinate outcome. It will not reveal that something is true or false. Deconstruction rather requires first and foremost the relentless pursuit of the impossible. One question leads to another question and another. When I was a little girl, I remember watching Back to the Future. In one scene, the main character, Marty McFly, is peering into a television screen. And I remember thinking in a slightly existential fashion at the time, what if he is watching a screen, but I'm watching him watching a screen, and I'm actually within a screen being watched by somebody else? This is the kind of endless questioning the deconstructive method embodies. The method itself is the end game, and rather than aiming to separate the problem from the resolution, the means itself cannot be distinguished from its end. This endless process of questioning is the end in itself. Thus, if deconstruction is not set in a circumscribed or limited context of truth, the negotiation of norms simply continues forever and ever, and reaching a resolution is neither desirable nor possible. And we'll return to this point in my final remarks after I talk about this case study that I wish to look at to show you how this theory is played out when applied in practice. So I have selected Meghan Markle's podcasts to demonstrate how the modern phenomenon of deconstruction has already permeated our political and social culture. So in inductive reasoning terms, her podcast episodes act as symptoms of the larger cultural malaise we presently find ourselves. An ideology rooted in subjective truths presented in the guise of authenticity and social justice eating away at the very structural fabric of knowledge. So in an interview with Variety on the 20th of October, Markle said regarding her podcast that its purpose is to quote unquote dissect and break down the tropes that hold women back, that have defined women as one-note human beings, and it allows Markle and her guests to dig a little deeper than they've ever been allowed to dig before. By what means? The overt mission statement of Archetypes is to attack past and existing institutional structures in the process. She offers to deconstruct labels which have come to define women in a restrictive way. Here, this presupposes that there are other meanings which are lurking in the background, waiting to be freed, and that in the past they have been repressed in favor of the dominant constructions. So in each episode, she selects a certain archetype viewed from her perspective as restrictive and proceeds to deconstruct them. I was going to go on to add quite intuitively in order to allow the meaning that has become trapped or suppressed to come to the surface. But I realized that would be giving her too much credit, because I don't think she actually gives a sophisticated version of the repressed idea. So Markle does break down the so-called archetypes, but she does not go so far as to offer an account of the repressed meaning. It just seems to end by leaving us still feeling silenced and suppressed by the system. So even a quick overview of the titles of her episodes aired to date reflect the podcast's clearly deconstructionist agenda. Episode 1 is called The Misconception of Ambition. Episode 2 is called The Duality of Diva. Can you see the binaries? Episode 3, The Stigma of Singleton. Episode 4, The Demystification of Dragon Lady. Episode 5, The Decoding of Crazy. Episode 6, Breaking Down the Bimbo. So episode 5 opens with a trigger warning for some heavy subject matter, because she's trying to dismantle something. She's trying to expose it to the light. The discussions occur neither for the purpose of advancing knowledge of a particular academic subject or furthering a specific literary genre, but simply for the sake of breaking down or deconstructing in order to dismantle what already exists. So to expose for the sake of exposing. So in episode 5, The Decoding of Crazy, she starts her introduction by problematizing the word crazy. She says, raise your hands if you've ever been called crazy, hysterical. What about nuts? Insane, out of your mind, completely irrational. Okay? She starts by listing specific labels here, signifiers that have been accepted as the basis for certain truths, allegedly, which she sets out to deconstruct. She says, and it's no wonder when you consider just how prevalent these labels are in our culture. I feel like you guys think that we like choose to be crazy. Sorry, her tone is hard to imitate. The institutional norm she views of calling women crazy, the implied users of this problematic dominant term being men and sometimes even naive women themselves, is what must be deconstructors. And she shamelessly in this process engages in the language games, the wordplay, in the actualizing of deconstructive ideology or theory. So she plays a series of sound bites from a range of different media productions in this particular episode, popular sitcoms, and then randomly one of Dr. Jordan Peterson's many academic discussions. And later in the podcast, even sets up Plato, the classical Greek philosopher himself, for deconstruction. So what she's trying to do here is to expose traditional and historical constructions of the label she has chosen as being dominant. She states with regards to Plato, and I have to scratch this itch, sorry, so I'll just say, quote unquote, she says, and I just learned this when we were doing this episode, the word hysterical, it comes from hysteria, which is, wait for it, the Greek word for womb. Plato was actually among the Greek philosophers who believed that the womb would travel around the body, adding pressure to the other organs, which would then lead to erratic and unreliable behavior. So on this point, not only is she perpetuating misinformation, so experts of classical Greek philosophy, classical Greek language have concluded that the original Greek passage, which allegedly contained Plato's erroneous belief, was in fact itself erroneous because it alluded to the sexual impulse, not the uterus itself. But the takeaway from all this in terms of her attack of anything that has come before her is what she's trying to achieve here. She's trying to attack the things that have been established over time, that have stood up to reason, because she feels that the deconstructive method legitimizes that. And I think it gives a false air of legitimacy to it because the methodology itself seems quite complex. It seems nuanced. But therein lies the deception, I suppose, or its potential ability to be duplicitous, because the complexity should not detract from the fact that it doesn't have an end game. It does not actually have an ontology or a normative aspiration. It doesn't have a trajectory towards an end. So she is pitting the signifiers against each other to renegotiate a new meaning, and the new meaning that is one that will push the most favorable narrative for her particular class up to the surface from its currently repressed or oppressed position, trapped behind the dominant label. So fraught with so many logical and conceptual contradictions, the only continuity I could glean from the episodes is the constant tearing down of things, her loose use of terminology, the repeated misinformation for the sole purpose of recharacterizing the class to which she happens to belong to. And this pitting of narratives against each other to rearrange the dominance hierarchy therefore seems to be a calculated way that deconstructionists like Markle have chosen to reassign meaning to words in order to advance the truth that best suits them. So a few final remarks. As previously noted at the end of the section in Derrida's theory of deconstruction, what happens when we play deconstruction out in practice, in the real world? Humans are inherently fallible, whether we like it or not. We all make mistakes. We are susceptible to cognitive biases and errors of judgment. To add, we are subject to scarcity, a lack of information, a lack of time, a lack of energy. Even if we disagree on everything, we can all agree that this is our reality. If so, then what happens when we slot the deconstructive theory into our legal, political, and social realities? A theory which self-admittedly professes to breaking down for the sake of breaking down. What will fill the void once everything has been dismantled? When we have deconstructed all existing truths like justice, the rule of law, the common good? Well, what we are left with are our subjective experiences. In place of striving for something greater than us, we are left with our feelings. and what we feel at any given time becomes the new reality. But this time, it's given at least a false sense of legitimacy through this complex deconstructive methodology. Thank you for joining me for my video today regarding the deconstructive method of Derrida. Please leave your comments in the section below. By all means, go and do your own reading on this subject. I think it's an important one. I have written previously on this matter, and I'll leave that article title in the title section. So thank you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Until the next video then, take care.